Hi everyone, we're going to evaluate this integral given, and we're using integration by parts. So we're using this formula here, and since we're doing the integral is from 0 to 1/2 of inverse cosine of x dx. So what we're going to do is let's go ahead and let u equal inverse cosine or cosine inverse of x, and let's let dv equal dx. Therefore, derivative of u is right here. So that's just going to be negative derivative of x divided by square root of 1 minus x squared, and let v equal x. So using our formula, and I'll just write this as my integral, we get the integral from 0 to 1/2 cosine inverse of x dx equals, and we're going to multiply u dv. So we're going to multiply u times v, so that's going to be x cosine inverse, and we're going to evaluate this from 0 to 1/2, and then we'll do this part minus the integral of 0 to 1/2 of this. So negative, that's just going to be x dx, that's negative, divided by square root of 1 minus x squared. Now, since these are both negative, take that out and make this a positive. Now, before we continue on, I'm going to look at this and change this. I'm going to let t equal 1 minus x squared. So, therefore, dt would equal negative 2x dx. And therefore, x, if I solve for x for this, I'm going to get x equals dt divided by negative 2 dx. And I'm going to substitute. So from here, I'll just put my interval equals x inverse cosine of x. We're going to evaluate it from 0 to 1/2 plus, now I'm going to rewrite this. This part here is x. So x is negative dt divided by negative 2 dx. Then you have the dx here, so that those two will cancel. Divided by t. And that's going to give you, finally writing it out again, you're going to get, it's the square root. You got to put the square root there. So finally, when you write it out, you're going to get equals x inverse cosine of x, evaluate it from 0 to 1/2, plus, and then this is just going to be, I'm going to write this as t to the negative 1/2 times, and this part right here is just going to be negative 1/2 dt. And I don't know why this negative's here. Okay, so that's that. However, what we have is we're going to have to change these two numbers since we did substitution. So to change those two numbers, when t is, let's see, when we have 0 right there, plug this into here and you get 1. So instead of 0, I'm going to put 1 here. Because you have 1 minus 0. And then for the 1/2, I'm going to plug 1/2 in here. So you get 1 minus 1/2 squared, which is 1 minus 1/4, which is 3/4. So we got to change this to 3/4. And now we can finish this up. So let's write this again. So we're going to have x cosine inverse of x. We're going to evaluate it from 0 to 1/2. And then we're going to have the plus 1 to 3/4 inverse, or t is negative 1/2. And then negative 1/2 dt. Now we can complete this. So our interval is going to be, let's evaluate this part first. So you plug in 0, you're just going to get, you'll start with 1/2. You plug in 1/2, you get 1/2 times inverse cosine of 1/2 is going to be pi over 3. Now when you plug in 0 in here, this is going to zero that out. So that's all we have for that. Okay, plus, now let's do the antiderivative of this. And that's going to give you, before we start that, let's remember, always put the bigger number here. So this would be 3/4 here, and then 1. So when I integrate this, I'm just going to get square root of t. And this is going to be from 1 to 3/4. So when you multiply this, you're going to get pi divided by 6 plus, and then plug this in first. So this is going to be square root of 1 minus the square root of 3/4. So this is pi divided by 6 plus, that's just 1, minus square root of 3 divided by 2. And if you want to simplify this further, we can pull out a 1/6, and that would give you pi plus 6 minus 3 square root of 3. And that's it. Thank you. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.